Ready to go.
Well, how's everybody doing today? Well, it's a very hip crowd today, I can see. Anybody know what day today is?
President's Day.
Al, what day is it today?
It's your day.
It's the 18th, that's right. Nothing very significant except a national holiday today. We might have figured that in a little bit when we scheduled this, but Washington County Public Affairs Forum is a forum dedicated to getting ideas out in the community. The volunteers of the Public Affairs Forum are committed to getting information before the public, and the public can do with it what they may, but our volunteers, our members, they get to ask a question, one question generally, sometimes as many as 6, but most people try to adhere to the one question rule. On a smaller attendance day like today, we might allow follow-ups. What's the will of the body? On a low turnout day, do people get follow-ups, questions?
Sure.
I heard one sure. Somebody else has to affirm that.
Yeah.
Make them get back in line.
You move to the back of the line and you can do your follow-up question. Okay, we had the proponents of firearm limitations last week, and now we have an individual named Kevin Starrett, who's the director of the Oregon Firearms Federation. The Oregon Firearms Federation was founded in 1998 to address the erosion of gun rights that was occurring because of the existing, quote, gun lobby, unquote, it decided to give away the store. This is, of course, the remarks of Mr. Starrett. Basically, their 501c4 lobbying organization takes positions, and they believe that there should be no compromise on fundamental issues. Since its inception, they've been successful in defeating almost all gun legislation introduced in the Oregon legislature. And essentially, they funded multiple court challenges, including one on behalf of the teacher in Medford who wanted to bring a firearm onto campus. Mr. Starrett himself is the founder and executive director of OFF, which of course is the acronym for Oregon Firearms Federation. And he was also the Northwest representative for Gun Owners of America, for whom he worked in New York. He grew up in New York as a commercial photographer by trade, and essentially became a lobbyist as a reaction against the politics in the commercial photography business. So he lives in Canby with his wife and 2 sons, and let's give a warm public affairs welcome to Mr. Starrett. And Mr. Starrett's got to recognize it would be warm now, but the questions might be hot later. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thank you for inviting me. Opportunity to share some facts, actually, which I think are in somewhat short supply. Just to clarify, the teacher in Medford situation was never about her bringing a gun to school. What happened was it was discovered that she had a concealed handgun license, and as a result, the school district and her principal started harassing her. What happened is she was dragged into the principal's office. The blinds were lowered, and a police officer came in, and she was told that if she brought a gun to school, she would be arrested and fired, and they felt okay searching her car at any time. Which, of course, none of this is true, because had she brought a gun to school, that would have been perfectly legal, and they could fire her, but they can't arrest her. So, as far as my experience as a commercial photographer, what I'd actually said was that I left that business because I couldn't handle the politics, and so I became a lobbyist. And that's the first time anyone's actually laughed at that, and been trying that line out for a really long time. Most of the time, when I'm in a position, I'm explaining our feelings about policies and positions of why we support individuals' rights to own firearms. What I really wanted to do today was to discuss some things that you probably don't get to hear too much of. And I think that no matter what your position on gun rights is, if you believe gun rights should be universal, if you believe no one should have gun rights, what you're entitled to is the truth about what we're arguing about. And we rarely get it. Most of the time what we're responding to is what I'd like to call cliches, but cliches typically have some element of the truth to them. And what we hear usually has no element of truth to them. Now, personally, I believe I have a right and an obligation to do anything necessary to protect my loved ones, my family, and you may not share that belief, but that's your business. Given the emotional nature of this debate, we've seen laws passed through legislatures across the country, obviously in New York, sometimes in the dead of night, where they violate all their own rules to pass these regulations and to restrict people's fundamental liberties. In New York, they recently said, well, it's not enough to limit people to 10 rounds of ammunition, now we're going to limit them to 7 rounds of ammunition, which I thought was kind of peculiar. But what I wanted to address was some of the things that we hear regularly in this debate and maybe shed some light on the truth about them. The anti-gun folks, who, you had one of them here last week, that pretty much start almost every one of these discussions by saying, we're not trying to take anyone's guns away, and we respect the rights of hunters. They follow that almost immediately with a list of the guns they want to take away. Now, I wonder if I thought I had my visual aids here. I probably don't, but I have to ask this of the people who claim they want to protect the rights of hunters. Hunting, there's no constitutional right to hunt. And so, given that, and given that there's really no need to hunt, and given that the guns that hunters use are far more lethal than the guns they want to ban, you have to wonder, where does this constant mantra of we don't want to affect the rights of hunters come from? Well, where it comes from is a desire to divide the community of gun owners so that we can chip away at these people's rights first. But the fact is, as I said, it really makes no sense to defend hunting rifles, which are so much more, in fact, lethal than the very firearms that they're attempting to eliminate. Speaking of hunting, what we'll always hear frequently is, you don't need an AK-47 to kill a deer. Well, actually, you don't need to kill a deer at all. So what difference does it make what you shoot it with, Until the deer organize and become a real threat to the liberty of Americans and put us in bondage, it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense to even be discussing what we shoot deer with. That being said, we'll always be faced with the comments, sometimes laughable comments, by people who really understand nothing about hunting. And the fact is that, if you can't hunt, we've been told that if you hunt a deer with an AK-47, there'll be nothing left to eat. This is a comment that a legislator actually made. And the fact is that an AK-47 is a machine gun. It's not legal to own them. You can't hunt with them. It fires a small cartridge. You can't buy them. So why are we even having this discussion? Because it distracts from the real issues. And the real issues are that these people genuinely want to deprive us of virtually any firearm. I read the comments, and actually it's a U.S. Congresswoman who stated that if you hunted deer with heat-seeking bullets, when you shot it, you would cook it too. Now, really, folks, heat-seeking bullets, does anybody really believe this stuff? I mean, granted, we have a U.S. Congressman who stated that if we put too many military troops on Guam, it would capsize. So maybe this is the quality of people we get in Congress, or maybe just members of Congress have very fertile fantasy lives. But it's pretty dangerous to have people who have no idea what they're talking about passing legislation. You probably all have heard of Carolyn McCarthy. She's a congresswoman from New York. She introduced legislation that would ban, amongst other things, barrel shrouds. Now, I'm guessing somebody here knows what a barrel shroud is. But for those of you who don't, I'll tell you, it's a strip of sheet metal with holes in it that goes around the barrel of a rifle, which is intended to dissipate heat. Not terribly common because most rifles don't generate that much heat, but we've seen it on some really large belt-fed machine guns and other things that we're not allowed to own. And when she was asked what a barrel shroud was, she said, it's the shoulder thingy that goes up, okay? This is a woman introducing legislation to affect and restrict your liberties who doesn't even know what it is she's trying to restrict. Obviously, we hear a lot of talk about, quote, assault weapons. Do you know what they are? Okay? I've been a gun owner for over 40 years. I've been a firearms instructor for almost 30 years, and I don't know what one is, you know? Because frankly, there is no such thing. They're basically Bigfoot. They're unicorns. They don't exist. They're whatever Dianne Feinstein and Ginny Burdick say they are. There's no technical definition for what an assault weapon is. I can tell you what they are in New York. In New York, they're any firearm that holds more than 5 rounds. That means that your granddad's old lever-action Winchester is an assault rifle, assault weapon in New York City. What the definitions vary depending on who wants to take what away from you. But one feature that seems to show up all the time when we're discussing assault weapons is the evil and terrifying pistol grip, okay? All of these weapons have pistol grips. Now, I've wondered for a long time exactly what it is that makes a pistol grip so dangerous. I mean, I can have a pistol grip on my pistol. Why can't I have a pistol grip on my rifle? Whenever this comes up, the answers kind of range from ludicrous to comical, and sometimes they're both. I've heard people say that a pistol grip allows people to spray fire indiscriminately. I've heard them say that a pistol grip allows you, this is a direct quote, to fire from the hip more accurately like they do in the military. Now, I'm looking around this room, I'm guessing we have some veterans here. My second guess would be that if anyone did that in the military, they would get dope slapped in short order. How does a pistol grip make you shoot more accurately without aiming? And if it were true, and it isn't, it's nonsense, can you really make the claim that it's bad to be able to shoot more accurately? This is one of the catchphrases that we hear constantly that simply makes no sense. Pistol grip is nothing more than a handle that extends down from the stock of a firearm. It doesn't in any way change the function of the gun. It doesn't make it shoot faster or more accurately or increase the number of rounds available. In short, it's just meaningless. I mean, if you consider basic human anatomy, it actually makes it harder to shoot from the hip if you have a pistol grip on your gun. So why is this an issue? It's an issue because, once again, the people who want to restrict your liberties want to confuse you, because if you knew the truth, you might have a different opinion. One of the things we hear a lot about in the war of words, the cliches battles, is weapons of war. We have to get these weapons of war off our streets. The media calls them weapons of war, the politicians call them weapons of war. Barack Obama, who's famous for having done a TV presentation saying, I'm not taking your rifle, I'm not taking your shotgun, I'm on TV telling you that, who now, of course, is trying to take your rifles and shotguns, describe these things as weapons of war. Interestingly, weapons of war are the only guns in this country that are constitutionally protected. The only firearms that our Constitution says we're allowed to have are weapons of war. Now, people are shocked to hear that. But let's just forget about the pesky old Constitution for now. No one seems to care about it anymore. At least of all, our president, who's now decided that he can kill any U.S. civilian with no judicial or congressional oversight. And even the New York Times has suggested that we just get rid of the Constitution. Granted, you know, meetings like this might become a little harder to have. But every firearm that's out there, at one time or another, was a weapon of war. Flintlocks, revolvers, even bow and arrows were weapons of war. Everything that people hunt with is a weapon of war. It's just a weapon of a different era, but it's still a firearm that was designed to be used for warfare. The lever-action rifle I mentioned earlier, you know, your granddad's lever-action rifle, was advertised by Winchester in the 1800s as a firearm that would revolutionize warfare because it could fire so quickly. And we'd be able to mow down those irritating redskins And boy, did we ever, you know. Killed a whole lot of Sioux Indians at Wounded Knee, ironically enough, in one of our earliest gun confiscation attempts. There were a lot of soldiers killed too because of the chaos, but it was pretty successful by government standards. It wasn't so successful by the standards of the Lakota band who got shot up there. Now, if we're told we can't have weapons of war, but we're also told by the people who are anti-gun that they want to protect our rights to protect ourselves, that's okay. You know, hunters, self-defense, that's okay. What exactly are we allowed to own? What kind of firearm can we own, if not something that they call a weapon of war? Another issue that I think came up when Ceasefire Oregon was here was guns in schools. Now, for years, Ceasefire Oregon and other anti-gun advocates have been saying we should ban licensed concealed carry in schools. Now, this is particularly ironic in the wake of the Newtown shootings, but in the wake of shootings like Virginia Tech as well. The laws that Ceasefire Oregon and other anti-gun people are advocating were all in place in that school in Connecticut. School personnel, teachers, principals, other responsible adults, were forbidden by law from having the means to protect the children in that school. This is a brilliant plan. It worked out really well, didn't it? In fact, the day that that shooting took place, representatives from Ceasefire Oregon were down on the Capitol handing out flyers demanding that our legislature enact the kind of laws they have in Connecticut. How did that work out? Well, have a law saying that responsible adults are forbidden from protecting the children in their care. Oddly enough, if you go down to the Capitol, anytime the legislature's in session, the place is crawling with armed police. You can't go into a hearing room. You can't engage, be part of a hearing, an audience in a hearing, sit there, testify at a hearing, without there being a police officer with a gun sitting in the room. Why is it that the politicians, many of whom are so determined to take away your rights, consider their safety so important, they're so valuable, but to protect the children is out of the question? The politicians are more important than the babies are. Anyone know how many kids have died in school fires in the United States in the last 50 years? None. Not a single child. Why is that? Because we accepted the reality that fires happen, and we took steps. We got fire extinguishers, we got fire hoses, we have sprinklers in the ceiling, which I think we probably have here. We're better protected here than, in a lot of places. We understood that there was a potential for this danger, and so we had fire drills. And we took all of these steps to protect the kids. We taught the teachers how to protect the kids in their care. But we don't do that. We don't do that with school violence situations because we're in denial. We just want to say it's not going to happen. We can't allow teachers to be armed. We can't put cops there. We can't have our principals there. Why? Why is it that civilians are being told, certainly school personnel, that our Medford teacher case where we defended this teacher, the court said, well, schools can forbid their employees from having firearms. They can't forbid other civilians, but they can forbid their employees. And this is a very popular approach, to forbid the very people who we assume are responsible enough to protect the kids if there's a fire or if there's a medical emergency, and in fact to educate those kids. We forbid them from having the means to protect the kids in their care. Why do we do that? Why does Ceasefire Oregon and other groups say they want to end the lawful carry of concealed firearms in schools? Has there been an incident? No. We've had concealed carry in schools for about 25 years. There hasn't been a single problem. So why are we saying that there could be? Well, because I believe the way it was put when Ceasefire Oregon was here was that we have to prevent the possible vigilantism of parents coming to school. Well, where has that happened? This is just another fantasy. But I think that if you look at the situations that we've had, if you look at Newtown, you look at this carnage that happened in Newtown. And Newtown's a kind of a peculiar situation for a lot of reasons. One is I've never heard of a shooting on that scale where everyone was killed and no one was injured. There's a lot of anomalies, a lot of strange things going on, but one thing I do firmly believe is that it's extremely unlikely that any of the teachers or the adults who were in that building, after watching these babies get gunned down, and now they are in their last moments of life cowering somewhere before they were shot, I wonder if any of them actually thought, I'm so glad I don't have a gun because someone could get hurt. You know, it's funny, all of these events, these mass shootings, or most of these mass shootings, seem to be carried out by, you know, crazy loners, possible exception of Columbine, which was 2 crazy loners. But in every case, they were people who were obviously disturbed, but typically not people who had any particular training or any particular knowledge of this. The Newtown shooting, of course, was interesting in that it would have been the envy of any SEAL team to be able to produce that much carnage in that short of time. But I wonder, given the amateur nature of these people who did this killing, what would happen if we had a replication in this country, which most police agencies say is going to happen, if we had a replication of what happened in Belsen, Russia in 2004, where collections of armed terrorists took over a school, all right, and over 400 children were killed. I live in a place in Canby that's surrounded by schools. What's going to happen the first time professionals decide to take the battle that they've had overseas and bring it here, which is going to happen sooner or later? What if they attack multiple schools simultaneously? Do you think that the Canby Police Department is prepared to deal with something like that? The siege at Belsen was a pretty astonishing thing. I wonder if you were a parent in Canby and professional killers took over your school, I would be willing to bet that in the wake of the police being overwhelmed, you know, you would hawk your house and your watch and your butt on Main Street for a rifle and 100 rounds of ammunition to go in there and save your kids. I know I would. And speaking of, you know, ammo, we know the efforts both nationally and locally to restrict how many rounds of ammo you should have. This might be a good place to discuss the arms race that we're facing from the state. I'm sure you guys read the news. I'm sure you know that the Department of Homeland Security recently put in a requisition for 7,000 machine guns. That's the Department of Homeland Security. Who are they shooting? Okay, 7,000 machine guns, which in their requisition they described as personal defense weapons. If you buy it, it's an assault weapon. If the state buys it, it's a personal defense weapon. They've also purchased, or are in the process of purchasing, billions of rounds of ammunition. Hollow point ammunition, which our military is not allowed to use. In fact, the Social Security Administration is buying hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition. Social Security Administration? I mean, exactly what is it that they're facing? I'll tell you, you know, you go into a Social Security office, there's always a man there with a gun, not sure exactly what there is there to steal, but the state is clearly, I mean, it's very, very difficult now to find a box of ammunition or a firearm just because of all of the astonishing buy-ups that the state's been doing. Who really should be on the receiving end of 7,000 machine guns in the Department of Homeland Security? In any event, they wanted to limit the number of rounds of ammunition that you could have. So I want to kind of think this through a little bit. On a number of occasions, I had a debate with Senator Ginny Burdick on OPB. She said this other places. I believe Ceasefire Oregon's made this point, that the reason that we want to limit the amount of rounds of ammunition a person can have is because basically we want to control the behavior of mass killers. All right? A mass killer should not have access to more than 10 rounds of ammunition. Essentially, what they're saying is they want to inconvenience mass killers. Now, if it is in fact legitimate, and I should tell you that Burdick has a bill that would limit an ammunition magazine to 10 rounds, although she's claimed she really wants it to be 5 rounds. If it's a really legitimate idea to say we want to limit the amount of rounds that a mass killer could have, shouldn't we be limiting that to 0? I mean, is there an acceptable level of carnage in the eyes of the anti-gun people that this is a reasonable amount of people who can be killed, and this is an unreasonable amount of people who can be killed? I don't think that it's rational to say that the best approach to mass killers is to inconvenience them. But as I told you earlier, New York just changed its law from 10 rounds. They started with an unlimited number of rounds. 10 rounds, then they reduced it down to 7 rounds. Like, this is some kind of magic number. There's a magic number of rounds that you can have. And I've always been curious as to where that came from, that whole idea of there being an acceptable number of bullets that a person can have. On the other hand, if you agree, as they claim to, that people who feel the need to protect themselves, which I think should be everyone, that they have rights and those rights shouldn't be denied, does it make any rational sense to say to those people, to say to people who are protecting themselves, you can only defend yourself this much. This is how many rounds of ammunition you can have. I don't really know that that is a particularly rational thing. I imagine you've all heard the story a couple of weeks ago of a mom outside of Atlanta who was at home with her 9-year-old daughters when someone tried to break in the house. She called her husband, who called the police, and he told her to hide in this closet crawl space they had. So she did. She took her daughters, she retreated into the closet crawl space, and this guy who was breaking in broke down the exterior door, and then he broke down several more doors, including the door to the bedroom she was hiding in, until finally he broke down the door to the crawl space she was in. And there she was. She had in her possession a 6-shot revolver. She fired all 6 rounds, and she hit him 5 times. Now, he still got up and ran away, which is really, you know, a merciful thing, because he could have just as easily gone in there and killed both those kids. Would you have honestly said to that mother, here's the number of rounds you legitimately should have? And that guy was alone. What if he'd come with some friends, you know? I suspect that many of you are old enough to remember the LA riots, okay? You may recall that the city was kind of overwhelmed and the police largely retreated from where the riots were going on. I'm sure that many of you saw the video footage of a truck driver named Reginald Denny being dragged out of his truck and having his skull caved in by a bunch of rioters with cinder blocks. Now, Reginald Denny hadn't done anything to those people. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But he paid a lifetime price for being there. Now, I would ask all of us, I'd like to ask Burdick and I'd like to ask Ceasefire Oregon, if, having been in that situation, had you been a bystander or a witness to that situation, would you really think that it would be wise to limit your ability to protect yourself or people like Reginald Denny, who happened to drive into the wrong place and paid an enormous price for it? Would you really say, this is the number of rounds you should be allowed to have? And do you really believe that that kind of situation can't happen again? You know, Portland's fairly famous for its riots. And so what I want to leave you with is the idea that all of the restrictions and all of the rhetoric that we hear about sensible gun laws would only apply to people like you and I who are not prone to committing crimes in the first place. Universal background checks, which everyone asks for, it's laughable. People who commit crimes don't undergo background checks. But people who do undergo background checks, and I can tell you this because I hear it every single day, are frequently delayed for months or denied their rights because the background check system is so poor that they can't really tell who they want to approve and who they don't want to approve. And so in many ways it becomes just a switch, a way to deny people their rights, beyond the fact that it's a prior restraint on what should be a fundamental liberty. So the rules about no guns here, we're going to put up a sign, even Penny Okamoto tells you, we know that's not going to work. The mandatory background checks only apply to people who aren't predisposed to commit crimes in the first place. The limits on the number of rounds of ammo you can have are most likely going to be ignored by people who want to commit crimes of mass killings. It simply doesn't make any sense. And while we have this emotional response and a political response that something bad happened, Very often what we have as a response from politicians is that we have to do something. This is something, therefore we have to do it, with no thought given to what the actual outcome would be. My personal belief is that good people should not be restricted or denied the rights and the means to protect themselves, and bad people are going to ignore those laws anyway. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
This is my opportunity to make my little pitch here. Our program is open to the public generally, but only members can have the opportunity to question speakers. And this will be replayed on TVC-TV, Channel 21 Sunday at 8 p.m., Tuesday at 10 a.m., Thursday at 9:30, and Friday at 3 o'clock p.m. So let's all be on our best behavior and try to ask for one question.
Dolores Raymond, forum member. I would be interested in your perspective on how this dire situation might be improved with more funding for mental health treatment.
It's a great question, and one that's become very common. And I'm afraid that while it would be really nice to simply say we need to spend more money on mental health treatment, there's some dangers here that I don't think are frequently being addressed. Primarily, if we're dealing with a mental health issue, we're not dealing with something we can easily quantify. If you have a broken arm or asthma, these things can be diagnosed and understood and treated. Mental illness is a much more abstract situation, and what my concern is that while everybody is saying, both sides of this issue are saying, clearly what we need is to address more mental health, I don't know how you do that without the liability of saying, okay, I've determined, or somebody has determined, that this person is mentally ill, and then his rights have to be taken away. I was telling one of our members a few minutes ago about a gentleman I know who legally purchased some rifles. He lived in Medford, and the state police, in violation of the law, told the county sheriff and local cops that he'd made these purchases, and they decided as a result of that he was mentally ill. They surrounded his home in the middle of the night with 4 SWAT teams, dragged him out of his home with no accusation of a crime and no warrant, took him to a mental hospital, and confiscated all his guns. He gets to the mental hospital, the doctors say, there's nothing wrong with this guy, take him home. In the meantime, his home had been trashed, his property had been stolen, and so while I support any effort to increase our ability to understand and treat mental illness, I also recognize that there's an enormous possibility that it will be used to just say, this person's crazy and let's lock them up. And when you get locked up in those circumstances, you don't have any of the protections that you have when you're arrested. You'll remember that, the Soviet Union and Communist China had long used mental illness as a pretext for dragging people off to the camps. So, yep, it would be a good idea to address this, but I think we should do it with some care because liberty still matters. Thank you.
My name is Bill Kroger. I'm a forum member. In order to drive a car, which is a potentially lethal weapon, you have to have a license and have training. What do you think about the same idea for weapons?
I think that it's a mistake to compare cars with firearms, because when we get a license to operate a car, we're operating it in a crowded environment in a public place where there's a lot of other people doing it, and the potential for accidents is fairly high. Ownership of a firearm is a fundamental liberty, and you don't necessarily even leave your house with that, but if you do, you're carrying it on your person, it's being carried discreetly. There's not the opportunity for the kind of traffic infractions or accidents that happen. The other thing is, I would say that, yes, we theoretically license people to operate cars, but that has not prevented people, even people with licenses, from using them as weapons or from driving them so irresponsibly that they're still, I almost got killed 3 times on the way over here. So while we license people, I think we largely do it as a way to collect revenue. It doesn't in any way prove or guarantee that the person who's driving, if they in fact even do have a license, knows what they're doing. There are a lot of people who've been approved by the state who I don't want to drive with.
Chris Leslie, forum member. The laws have been on the books for years. Now, why do you keep wanting to change the laws to restrict guns? And why would people do that other than just political rhetoric?
I think there are two kinds of people who want to restrict firearms rights. I think there are the people like Dianne Feinstein and Ginny Burdick who genuinely believe that the public is too stupid to be able to have firearms, and they also feel a need to control the population. You know, politicians really think that the rest of us are beneath them. Then I think there are the people from the Ceasefire Oregon kind of people who are just genuinely paranoid, fearful people who don't understand the issue, who don't understand firearms, who don't know how they work, but for some reason they have this irrational fear of inanimate objects. When Ceasefire Oregon was here last, she made some comments about how she was standing on the Capitol steps during the last gun rally and she was surrounded by gun owners who intimidated her. Nothing like that ever happened. Even the first rally that happened down there was one protester. She was treated extremely courteously. I think there are people who just have an irrational fear and project that. And in many cases, you have people who think, well, anybody has a firearm, they can just go nuts. You know, it could happen anytime. There's a psychological term for that. It's called projection, and that is when you project your irrational behavior on other people. But I am quite confident that I could take a firearm and put it down on this table right now, and I don't think anyone in this room would pick it up and start killing each other. Nor do I believe that they're self-animated. You know, last week Penny Okamoto told you that firearms were like landmines. Firearms are not like landmines. Firearms don't kill people without somebody picking them up and pulling the trigger. You can't get hurt if you step on a firearm. But there's this irrational fear of things that do nothing. There's a webcam out there someplace. A guy's had this on for 10 years. His camera pointing at a revolver on a table in his house with a clock that's been running. 9 years, it still hasn't moved, 9.5 years. They don't do anything on their own. But I just think that there's a lot of people who, for whatever reason, a childhood experience or something like that, develop this irrational fear and just refuse to address the reality of what these things do. Sir.
Lee Coleman, forum member. I want to stick to the Constitution. In your opinion, as a constitutional scholar, is regulation the same thing as infringement?
Well, I don't believe I've ever claimed to be a constitutional scholar. Yes, ultimately, I do believe that it's impossible to restrict or regulate something without infringing it. I don't know how you could do one without the other. I think the Second Amendment, obviously a lot of people disagree, but I think the Second Amendment is fairly clear. I think that of all the amendments, of much of what our founders wrote, there are a few things that have less ambiguity than the Second Amendment does.
A follow-up. Are guns inherently dangerous like dynamite is?
No.
What's your basis for that assertion?
Because a firearm cannot do anything without a person operating it. So the rifles that are in my safe are not, I mean, they're not going to blow up. You know, even no matter what happens, they're not going to do anything on their own.
Dynamite doesn't blow up by itself either.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. Kathy Stanton, forum member. I think you made it clear on how you feel about universal background checks, but how do you feel about a registry?
Well, I think a registry serves one purpose, and I know this for a fact because, as I mentioned, I'm from New York, and in New York, you could not buy a rifle or shotgun without a permit from the police, and every rifle or shotgun that you bought was entered into a central registry. And shortly after, within a year after I left New York, the New York City Council decided that a vast number of the rifles that were registered were now contraband, which meant you turn them in. That's what it meant. There was no grandfathering, not that I would have approved of that. But the only way they could go to the homes of the gun owners and take those guns was because there was a registration of all those firearms. And the only purpose a registration system serves is to identify gun owners for future confiscation.
Most cases of these killings are not by responsible gun owners. They are by children or immature, as you call them, crazies. How can you identify them in a way that will protect the schools?
I don't know, and I don't think anybody does know. I think that if we had the answer to that question, things would be a lot simpler. I believe that there are too many factors that are not understood to be able to simply say this person is dangerous or that person is dangerous, and then what steps do we take after that? Had the shooters in Columbine or had the shooter in Newtown, all of which people had questions about. I mean, certainly the shooter at Virginia Tech had a long history of mental illness. Had some steps been taken, what would they have been? Lock these people up? I mean, I guess we could lock up everybody who we have concerns about. But as painful as it is to hear, I do believe that there are some situations that, given our current state of knowledge, that we can't fix every possible thing. We certainly can't do it without denying most people their liberties.
Eric Squires, forum member, could you give me 3 suggestions from the pro-gun ownership lobby that would help reduce the number of killings that we're seeing in our society?
Well, I don't think I need to give you 3. I think I can give you 1, and that is to recognize that any law that we write is not going to affect criminals. Even Ceasefire Oregon, when they were here last, admitted that there are millions of magazines and guns in circulation. And guns don't degrade. You know, a gun, you could put a gun in your closet, it'll be working 300 years from now. So we can write all the laws we want, and we can confiscate the property from all the law-abiding people, but as long as there's a place like Mexico, which has all the laws they want, and obviously that's a safe place, as long as there's places like that that provide our meth and our cocaine, there will be guns on our streets, and they will be in the hands of criminal people. That is not going to change. It is simply not going to change. In New York City, where guns are banned, you could always buy a gun from a crooked cop or a crooked ATF agent. Bad people will get guns and find the means to wreak havoc. The response could be what we've seen in New York and Chicago, where we continue to clamp down on the liberties of the law-abiding, and we see how that's worked in those places. Or we can tell the people who are willing to take responsibility for themselves that they are allowed to have the means to protect themselves, the very thing we've denied to the school employees in Connecticut, and we saw what happened. We have, 20 dead babies.
Kathy Stanton, forum member. Last week, Penny Okamoto gave her vignette stories. Today, you are doing yours. Both of them excellent examples of either end of the spectrum. I tend to view myself as living more in the middle. So when I was researching for this series, I was wanted to learn more about gun culture, especially in the United States of America, and I couldn't find any sociological studies on what makes America so different, both in this hemisphere and it seems worldwide in our freedom to own, operate, store guns. Is there any other country in the world, in the industrialized world, that has the open standards that we have with our Second Amendment rights?
Well, I think we have to understand that there's not a unified culture. I mean, in a lot of places in the United States, gun ownership is virtually outlawed. We are frequently told that we have a gun culture that exists nowhere else. I don't know that I necessarily buy that. I think that there are a lot of countries that have historically had more restrictions on their population. The United States was founded in a different way than most other countries were. I mean, even Great Britain, which has a long history of controlling its population, there's a camera on every corner, and they, over time, after several world wars, kept taking away their civilians' rights to own firearms, and of course their crime has skyrocketed as a result of that. But while I'm not necessarily sure I'm going to buy into the idea that we have some kind of specific gun culture, I would say we have historically had a culture of greater freedom than other countries have had. And with that comes along the idea that individuals take responsibility for themselves. And if you think about, Americans moving west from where they landed on these shores, there was always danger. There was danger because wild animals and battles that were going on. And so Americans became used to relying on themselves to somewhat greater extent than other countries which had already been largely settled and didn't really have frontiers. Now, you see the opposite of that happening in places like Australia, which is a big empty country, and where they were forced to give up most of their guns. But you also see in Australia what's not reported very often is the massive non-compliance that took place there. Canada developed a firearms registry, and every gun had to be registered with the federal government. And that went on for 10 or 15 years, and about 3 or 4 years ago, they finally abandoned it because nobody was complying, and it served no particular purpose. So I think there's certainly a lot of cultures that, whether industrialized or not, are far more violent than we are. I mean, people can be violent. People can be violent in any culture. But, the homicide capital of the world is Ecuador. And we see what's happening in places like Honduras and Brazil and a lot of places that have very severe gun restrictions. In Mexico, civilians can't own guns at all. Well, they can't legally own guns. But Mexico is an extremely violent place, and those people have machine guns and mortars, they have tanks, they have rocket launchers, and the imposition of restrictions on the population hasn't had any effect on their acquisition of weapons. The only thing it's done is it's gone to the people who are trying to survive, the normal population, the non-drug cartel people, and rendered them completely defenseless against the gangs.
Well, Lee Coleman again. You've made a number of assertions about gun grabbing and the so-called assault weapon ban as an attempt to grab weapons already in the hands of people. I would describe those as paranoid delusions, though I'm a legal specialist, not a psychiatrist.
I think I can
Have
see
you
that.
consulted a psychiatrist on
That's a ridiculous
irrational assertions of yours?
If it's irrational, and you explain to me why in New York City, everyone who had a firearm that was over 5 rounds, their firearms were confiscated. Now, if in your mind that's a paranoid delusion, then I don't really think we have much left to talk about, because as you said, you don't know much about that.
You don't have much left to talk about.
Let's be civil.
Sure. Okay. Is there, Karen, did you have a question? No. Okay. I'm thinking that as questions get more ad hominem, they become less relevant to the debate. So I'm going to allow Chris to finish up, and you can make a closing argument if you'd like.
Thank you, John. Kevin, what about Switzerland, where you're required in each household to own a gun?
Switzerland is an excellent example and proof that the possession or availability of firearms is not related to the amount of crime. As you know, in Israel in the 70s, they had frequent terrorist attacks on their schools. And they recognized, as we refused to do, that this was going on. So they armed teachers. And now you can get online and see countless photographs of 21-year-old girls walking the streets with AR-15 rifles. When I was in Switzerland, you'd see people getting on the train with military rifles, throwing them up on the luggage rack, and nobody gave it a second thought, because they were just not predisposed to violence. That what we have learned when the liberalization of concealed carry laws, where more and more states allowed people to carry firearms concealed, we saw none of the bloodletting that was guaranteed to be happening. And what we've learned is that the availability or the lack of availability of firearms is not the determining factor in how people behave. You go to sub-Saharan Africa, those people are chopping each other up with machetes all the time. It is the people and how they choose to behave that is the ultimate decider of what kind of violence is going to take place, and not the presence or absence of firearms. So with that, I want to thank you all very much for inviting me out. It was great to talk to you, and if you have any more questions or interests, our website is OregonFirearms.org. There's a lot of information there, and I answer phone calls. Thanks.
Again, that was Kevin Starrett, Director of the Oregon Firearms Federation. Again, next week we've got we've got Scott Porter, the Director of the Office of Consolidated Emergency Management. They're committed to development and maintenance of a county-wide integrated system to prepare for, respond to, and recover and mitigate against disasters. And they partner with a number of local cities. Again, I see other people independently filming, but you can actually look at this complete program on the cable television station, TVC TV, Channel 21, Sunday at 8 p.m., Tuesday at 10 a.m., Thursday at 9:30 p.m., and Friday at 3:30 p.m. Mr. Squires.
On our website.
And it's also on our website. I was getting to that. We have a website, and it's www.washingtoncountyforum.org, and we also have a Facebook. For those of you who are spending a lot of time on Facebook, here's an opportunity to spend a little more of your life. Washington County Public Affairs Forum, and if you twit or tweet, or are a twit or a tweeter, twitter.com/Washington County Forum, or / excuse me. So in any event, we have a board meeting after. For the board members, it'll be a quick meeting, and if you can stay. So I thank everyone for coming, and we're going to continue this discussion in the future too, so we'll see how it all goes. Thank you for coming, and I'm John Tyner, president of the forum, and at least for another couple months. Thank you.